The verification process at B Lab, which determines whether a company meets the standards for B Corp certification, can feel like a black box, obscure, unpredictable, and constantly evolving. From 2012 to 2019, I didn't focus much on verification because, frankly, it worked. But something changed during COVID. The process stopped functioning as it had before, and it hasn't fully recovered. During COVID, wait times ballooned to 12 months before assessments were even reviewed. Analysts seemed to disqualify portions of an assessment without clear explanations, and stricter documentation requirements appeared for certain types of companies. As a prospective B Corp, if your score dropped below 75 points during verification, your application was closed. End of story. No recourse, just 6 months of waiting to resubmit and get back in line. Perhaps the hardest part was B Lab's shift to what felt like a colder, distant, scattered, more bureaucratic posture during verification. It started to feel like the B Corps themselves, once the heart of the movement, were becoming an inconvenience for B Lab to manage. To be fair, I don't blame anyone at B Lab. I know the people there are warm and dedicated, doing their best with limited resources. Can you imagine managing a pipeline of 6,000 applications when the community itself was only 4,500 B Corps during a global pandemic? The pressure must have been incredible. This episode was like finally getting to peek inside that black box. I've had so many questions over the last few years. Who's making these decisions? How many people are behind a screen reviewing my assessment? Why were these changes made during COVID? And why didn't B Lab keep us in the loop? My guest today, Kali Gibson, is the perfect person to answer these questions. Kali worked at B Lab Global from 2012 to 2022, starting as a standards analyst and eventually overseeing the entire verification process. She even onboarded Ganeshatim, B Lab's first official verification partner. One important disclaimer to note, Kali uses the term we and our when talking about B Lab, but she no longer works for the organization. She left B Lab in August of 2022. So to be clear, Kali is not speaking for B Lab's current policies. Rather, this episode is partially a historical fact-finding mission to try to piece together what happened during a really difficult period of time. So, with that, let's jump into the episode. The first half of this episode dives into a fascinating history of how the B Corp verification process worked between 2012 and 2019. Kali shares insights that clarified things I'd never fully understood. In the second half, we get into the post-COVID changes, including some revelations about why the process has become such a mystery. I've listened to this episode over 5 times, and I'm still uncovering new insights. You might want to replay it to catch everything we discuss. As always, Emmy and I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop us a line at beyond@lifteconomy.com. Let us know what questions or comments come up for you after listening. And with that, enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
Our guest today is Kali Gibson. Kali has over 12 years of experience supporting and consulting organizations on embedding impact and innovation into their culture and strategy. Kali spent 10 years of her career working at B Lab Global in roles ranging from standards analyst to senior manager of training and knowledge to co-director of certification and verification. Today, she has her own consultancy and works with organizations like the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, Impact Hub, and various businesses who need support with impact measurement and management, innovation, and strategy. Most recently, Kali has been exploring regenerative design and has a certificate from the Regenesis Institute. Kali lives in Pennsylvania, USA, where you can find her hiking, gardening, and serving on her local food co-op board of directors. Kali, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Kali, we go back many years. I believe you joined B Lab in 2012, around the same time that I first got involved in the movement. But I actually don't know a little bit of the backstory before that. So how did you first get involved in like, how did you even come to the awareness of B Lab and get involved in the first place?
Yeah, it's really by chance, I'd say. So you're right. 2012 is when I started at B Lab. I did my undergrad at Eastern University, which is in Wayne, Pennsylvania, which is a small town outside of Philly. And randomly at that time was also the headquarters of B Lab. So I studied economic development, and that was when social entrepreneurship was pretty new topic. So it was really great that I was able to take that class, and naturally the B Corp certification came up in it. And I was really interested at that time of how business could be interwoven with doing good. And when I heard about B Corp certification, that sounded exactly like what I was interested in. So I remember Googling, being like, I want to work for them. Where are they located? And like my surprise that they're actually in this little town that I was at for college. So that's how I first heard about them. And when I graduated, I knew I wanted to work for B Lab. So I applied to really any role they had at the time. I was really interested in course of the standards and the certification itself. And in 2012, I was able to join as, I think, standards analyst or associate back then was the first term. And I was, I think, one of 20 employees back then.
Yeah, I was going to ask how big was the team? So 20 people.
Wow.
Yeah, I think there were 3 or 4 analysts. So those are the individuals actually working with businesses on the certification. It was a small team. And back then, the global partners, if you think of the global footprint, we didn't have, I don't think, B Lab Europe or UK yet. I know we had Sistema Bay, but it was really early days.
Mm.
Yeah. And so how did B Corp certification and like the verification process? So maybe what is out of B Corp certification? Like, what is the verification process and how did you, first get introduced to that?
Yeah, so the verification process is all of kind of the back end stuff that happens after a business fills out the B impact assessment, which back in 2012 was more like a PDF you filled out or an Excel that you filled out. And verification was, okay, well, how do we take the answers that the company provided us and how do we validate them and ask the questions that are the most material and do kind of like an interview. And we had documentation that we reviewed. So how do we get to a place where we can see if what they answered is accurate and we feel comfortable enough to actually administer and provide them with the certification? So early days, that we called it a review call. So it was kind of a phone call interview where we'd walk through, back in the day, we'd walk through every question, if you can imagine that, and basically provided them with context of what the meaning of the question was to ensure they answered it correctly. And then we had documentation we requested for certain questions. And we did a random on-site visit every year of different percentage of companies. So we got to go in person at times too to validate and interview employees and further look at their score and see if anything changes based on what we're hearing from them. Yeah, so a mixture. And that's still in place today. It just obviously looks a little bit different. And I'd say the idea of matching risk with rigor became something we did when I was started. We certified every company the same. And over time, that verification looked a little differently when you realize that a one-person company probably needs different verification than at a company with 1,000 employees or more.
Yeah. And I realized I should probably just set the stage for folks who are listening, for the audience. So one of the reasons we're excited to have Kali on is, as a B Corp nerd, Emmy and I have been in the community for many years. I actually first got involved right around the time that Kali first started at B Lab. And the verification process has always been a bit of a mystery. I understand some of the reasons, and Kali was both a standards analyst and then worked in verification and then was like leading the verification team for B Lab Global. And so part of asking her on today was to say, we'd love to just learn a little bit more about verification. Luckily, Kali does not currently work at B Lab. So her last, it was 2022 was when
Correct.
2022. So nothing in this episode should be taken as like, this is what B Lab currently does, but it's more of like a historical, shedding some light on how verification worked and what better person to do it than Kali, who literally was there for 10 years, and on the sort of lowest rung of the standards analyst side, all the way up to leading and co-director of the whole verification and certification team. So yeah, that's a little bit of the framing for why we're having this episode. And then, yeah, Emmy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. So, going back into those early days of verification at B Lab, you mentioned that you're realizing that you had to cater the verification process to the company size. Were there any other challenges that you faced early on in the process?
Yeah. Yeah, lots of challenges, as you can imagine, a startup organization has. So thinking of verification, that was one of them, but also our interest across the globe really increased at that time. So simple things like not having the B impact assessment in every language that is for the companies that are pursuing the certification. And then them submitting documentation in, of course, their language, and us not having necessarily the skills in-house to be able to verify that. So a lot of good problems to have, because the interest in certification had really increased and was starting to really expand beyond the US, which previously it had been really focused on. And then, of course, the challenge of just general capacity comes into place as the interest increases. The number of certifications one person can do is only so much. So that's when it kind of started expanding. And from there, we could think about, all right, now we have new language needs. A challenge was knowing a local context enough to be able to feel comfortable verifying a business practice in a particular area. So there were a lot of things that we had to think about when it came to expanding the team and where we expanded the team, what type of professional development was needed. But there were other challenges too. So I can dive into any of them specifically, but one was part of the beauty of the B Corp movement is there's a lot of innovation that happens, right? We see a lot of groundbreaking business models and really interesting HR policies and practices, which are all really good. But when you are trying to maintain a standard, sometimes that kind of comes and you're like, I don't know if this applies to this question. I've never seen this before. So, and B Lab, I know, still deals with that challenge, which is a good challenge to have because it means things are changing and hopefully we're creating innovations that are tackling challenges that we have. But the early days, we also had to figure out, what do we do when, as an analyst, I don't necessarily know if this meets the intent of the question because I've never seen this before. And this comes up a lot with impact business models. So those are business models that are really unique to a business and are usually around their product or service, but it can also be how they operate, and it's tied to a specific social and environmental impact. So that's where we saw a lot of innovation, and we had to determine if it met the criteria of that particular section, which is heavily weighted when it came to the scoring. So there's something called assessment decisions that we came up with to be able to address when those questions came up. And it was a mixture of learning and looking at historical information to see maybe we have had a company like this before, but they use different language. So we looked back, but we also had to look forward and do our own research and at times bring in experts to say, hey, do we actually think that this new business model is meeting the intent of this local economy, section or whatever it might be. So that was another challenge. And I'll maybe name one more and then pause. But the other one is we had different industries coming to us. So pretty soon we started seeing industries that we would consider controversial or industries that we weren't sure we wanted to have within the community or if we should. So there was also this idea of a background check and this kind of legal review of businesses, especially as they were larger, for us to better understand, what are the risks of welcoming someone into the community in a particular industry, and also doing a background check and saying, all right, they've had a material litigation. Should that keep them from the community or not? So there was also this kind of legal aspect that we had to deal with. Again, a learning curve when it comes to skill sets and just knowing how to handle as we had more and more businesses coming to us. So that's just a few to give you a flavor of some of the things that made day-to-day really interesting, but also challenging.
Yes, a few of many for sure. Your talking about how verification has a very interesting relationship with the B Corp standards. And the standards themselves are managed quite differently. And a lot of us know that we're going through the sort of the evolution process. But I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the relationship between verification and the standards. How does the verification team, like, and you were mentioning it earlier, you're like sort of figuring out how these innovative business models can be applied to the existing set of standards and also with like a little bit of flexibility. But maybe you could walk us through sort of how the standards come to be and then how verification works to enforce those standards.
Yeah, good question. So early days, to my memory, the standards, which we now call, I think, standards management, which is the maintenance, creation, holding the standards themselves, and the verification team that use those standards to verify companies in order to meet the B Corp certification requirements. Early days, those were pretty intermixed. I don't remember there necessarily being more than one person, like helping with the standards. And I don't remember what version of the B impact assessment we were on back then, maybe version 2 of the first. So it was really early days. So back then it was very mixed. We had, both kind of in the room at any time. But as things progressed and there was more interest, then we realized, like the standards need to be updated. And it's a really big job, especially again, when now you're talking about introducing multiple languages for the first time and making sure that we're asking questions that are relevant. The creation of a standards team was actually developed. So the roles were more distinct, yet they still work really closely together. So when the standards are updated, for example, which, previously there were every couple years, they were updated based on feedback that businesses could leave in the assessment and a little feedback button, but it was also updated heavily based on feedback from the verification team. So we were one of the main stakeholders working with the standards team to say, hey, I've asked this question of businesses 200 times. They never can answer it correctly because the wording doesn't make sense. Or this answer option, based on data, we can see that like every business is answering the highest answer option. Like maybe our answer options are no longer relevant or things have changed. So the standards team uses a mixture of data and feedback from both in-house and externally to be able to make changes. And of course, doing research on trends and what the latest regulations are and things like that. Another way that these two teams connect is once the standards are developed and they're out there, we then need to, the verification team is actually applying them day to day. So I mentioned assessment decisions or times when there's a decision that needs to be made when it's gray. A lot of times those two teams would come together to help support what the next step should be, because the standards management team really has a clear understanding of the history of the question, the research behind the question, the intent, any mapping that question has to other certifications or standards. And then the verifier kind of has like that really great lived experience with the business. So when there's a question, they'll often bring those two groups together to discuss and be a part of, does it get credit or not? Or what do we need to maybe elevate this to the Standards Advisory Council, which is a third-party body that oversees the overall standards themselves. So there was a lot of collaboration there. But again, early days, it was pretty mixed. And now it's very distinct, two teams that work closely together. But yeah, early days, I remember being, again, a small team. So we could all be in the room together, kind of going through, here's our list for the week of companies that we talk to that have some innovation that we're not sure how to apply.
Thanks for that, Kaylee. Super helpful. From the standards advisory committees, could you just explain, maybe for folks listening who don't know what those are? And then did you ever intersect with those at all on your verification side, like in your work?
Yeah, so the Standards Advisory Council or Committee, like I said, is this third-party body of experts in different areas that are there to advise and have like final sign-off on the standards themselves. So when there are changes made to the standards or an introduction of we have something called addenda, which are very specific questions for industries like investing or building and design or very specific things that agriculture, for example. So that third party would be the ones that are signing off on the overall standards. And the idea is that they're a mixed group of people who have all different experience in different content areas, so they can speak to different aspects or different parts of the assessment. If you think of the different like impact pillars, the Standards Advisory Council meets and reviews really high level decisions that we couldn't do ourselves. And they can also review controversial things, or if there are certain lawsuits a company has and we're not sure the decision on if we can certify them or not, or what the next steps would be for the company to implement in order to move forward, the Standards Advisory Council would meet to do that. The verification team really doesn't have much interaction with them. They do work closely with the standards management team. I'd say definitely much more so. But the verification team at times, when I was there at least, we might join a meeting to explain a situation that we experienced to provide more context. But ultimately, the Standards Advisory Council would make those decisions that had to be elevated to them. So if we felt like we couldn't handle it ourselves, or we didn't have the expertise, we could move it up and have at the highest level them look at it. And with the changes to the standards in general, they're the ones that are there to review and have the final feedback and say on it. So it is definitely a third party group of individuals that are doing that. And then again, it's our job to apply them. Our job, I say, are still, B Lab's job to apply those standards the best that they can through the verification process. Does that help, Ryan?
It's super helpful. Yeah. So Kali, in terms of these decisions that are made where it's a little bit in the gray area, could you speak to how often is this really coming up? And then do you have I don't know if you have any examples off the top of your head, don't want to put you on the spot, but what's an example of something that might be in that gray area that you kind of had to grapple with?
Yeah. So I would say they came up more and more as the years went on. When I left B Lab in 2022, I think we had 80 people on the certification and verification team, including some of our partner verifiers. So you can imagine we're working with hundreds of companies a week. So this was definitely, it had an uptick as we expanded globally, industries, and things became more complex. Early days, we met assessment decisions, as we called it. We met weekly to talk through, and we might only have 2 things to say, to talk about, but we would meet pretty regularly. As the time went on, we actually, because we were all part of assessment decision early days, right? There's only 4 of us. So we would all sit around a table and then elevate it as needed. But as time went on and the team grew, we actually have a dedicated group of people from the certification team that were trained on, again, assessment decisions and how to do research, how to look at past decisions. And we went from, a 300-page Google Doc to an actual CRM system that was built in so we could track the decisions, map them to region, to industry, and it made it a lot easier to actually look at historical information, and we could log them online. So it became more of a rolling basis role or job because they were coming up all the time, 10 a week, maybe more, depending on who you're working with. So, and talking about, not to go into a new topic quite yet, but around wait times and why certifications started taking longer. This is one example of something that takes time. When we were getting new things put onto our plate, we want to do a good job. You want to do your due diligence, and that takes time. So we would, even though we put it electronically, it made it a lot easier, but it still took a dedicated group of people having discussion. And like I said, elevating it at times to the Standards Advisory Council or getting standards management team for input. So yeah, definitely increased. And like I said, a good challenge to have, but takes time. An example of this, I remember early days, this probably to most listeners is going to sound like, well, this is something that's been around, but this idea of the sharing economy. I remember the first time we had a car share company come to us and a clothing share where you could kind of rent clothing and return it. This was very new. So we had to have a whole conversation. We didn't really have a good fit in the environment section for something that you're borrowing and returning or renting and returning, or a system so you could put your car and say, hey, my car is free on Tuesday. Do you want to use it to eliminate what the claim was, to eliminate materialism and waste? This was brand new. So that's one example of something that I think now clearly shows up in the B impact assessment as probably an example and a place for it. Back then, we didn't know. I'll give you another example that's interesting is time off. So there's an operational question around what time off do you give your employees? Well, we had companies saying we have unlimited time off. Well, back in 2012, that was fairly new policy. And we had, I think our answer options were like 0 to 5 days, 5 to 10 days, 10 to 15 days, et cetera. There was no option at that point that said unlimited. And we had to have a deep discussion on, okay, what credit do people who have unlimited policies get? Should we be looking at the actual number of days that their team members are taking? Because they might have an unlimited policy, but the culture is that no one takes time off. So that was like another conversation that we had to have. And I know now there's dedicated help, context, and information on how to answer that question if you have unlimited time off. So it got juicy at times. Oh, yoga pants was another big one. Like, is that considered a health product or not? I could give you lots of examples.
Yoga pants are definitely a health product. I don't know.
I love it.
One other question on this, and then Emmy, I'd love to hear if you have further questions, is on the novel IBM. So what is let's say there's a company that is, hey, we're trying to capture rainwater on a porta potty or something like that, like something that's never, and use that to flush the toilets. How would you actually say, how do we even deal with this? I have no idea how we would track this. Is there a process, or is it just kind of hey guys, here's this novel situation and what should we do? And just brainstorming, or is there a procedure of how you would go about looking at that?
Yeah, there was a procedure as far as the type of information we asked of the company. So just like any impact business model or IBM, if you're claiming it has impact, there should be some type of documentation that the company can provide to show that at least early outcomes, if not impact yet. So we did have a procedure of, a list of things that we had to gather from the business to be able to then use that to review and make a decision. And we had also, there's a whole framework. And honestly, my last few years at B Lab, I wasn't officially a part of that assessment decisions team. So I can't really bring to mind exactly what the criteria were, but it was quite standardized at the end. There was very specific procedures they went through, specific documentation they looked at, and then kind of like a scorecard that you could use and kind of go through. So you could say, all right, the company, clearly has good information in this section, but there's no impact data here. But we have research externally that says, yes, this type of product actually does, where you're using porta potty water, whatever, it actually shows there's impact. So we could use a mixture of research that already exists for similar business models, if they do, and kind of use that alongside what the company has. So that's a long way of saying, yes, there's definitely standard procedure, standard documentation that's required, and standard ways to go about the research that you would do if the company maybe doesn't have it all on their own. And for smaller companies, they might not be able to afford some of these, big research projects. So we were able to use a mixture of what they had and what we felt was validated out in the market already.
Yeah, I wish that people could know just how many touch points a decision, like a review, goes through behind the scenes. There's so many people that, especially if there's, something in question or there's something particularly innovative, just how many folks are involved in the process of making those kinds of decisions. I'm curious if you could say at all, if we did take a review through the process and I guess from start to finish, how many folks end up actually reviewing a review?
Yeah. I mean, good question. I think I'll just preface it by saying it differs widely, right? Because now there's a lot of multinational corporations, and that's a whole other conversation. I should also say that my role at B Lab right before I left was the co-director of certification and verification, and that was specifically on what we called small, medium companies and the partnership. So I don't know as much, especially now, to speak towards how many for the larger, but just know that would be many more than whatever it is for the smaller companies. But just to give you a sense, even the most, straightforward company, before they even get to B Lab Global, most of them are interacting with a global partner representative, someone from their local region that is maybe assisting them in some way. Then there is a certification analyst, usually at the global partner, who is doing the credibility review and actually making sure they're right. If they're in operations for a year, that they're in actual business and registered, things like that. Then when you get to B Lab Global, you have someone who is in charge of looking at submissions and assigning them to different analysts or reviewing that. You have the analysts themselves. Sometimes there's 2 analysts assigned to a business, depending on, for the listeners, I'm holding up my finger. I'm already at 5 as I'm saying this. So you have, the analysts themselves. And then I would say most are either going to need a touch point either from an assessment decisions, which could be multiple people, a background check item that could require the legal team to look at. It could be, again, something controversial comes up. So usually there's something, and you have to also remember that every standards analyst has a manager and a support team, so there's people that are being reviewed and asking questions. And then you have assessment checks, like a final review of the assessment. So if everything goes smoothly, I'd say about 10 people at least. And again, that's not people that are looking at the actual assessment of the business or looking at all the detailed information, but it's people who are in some way or form are assisting, again, like I said, really high level, saying, hey, this company submitted, who do we give them to? Or actually assisting with a decision. And that final review is also a really great accountability and part of B Lab's credibility to make sure that, we do have more than one eyes for the final check to make sure that there wasn't anything material missing or that the business model was represented in the right way. And then after that, it's handed, back to the B Lab regional team to welcome them to the community. So it just keeps increasing. But it takes more resources than I think most people think, and a lot of infrastructure too for, a lot of tech for all of these things to happen. And we're doing this across the globe. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how quickly it can increase from 10 people to many more people. It's like there's the risk team, there's a complex structure team, there's the standards teams and the assessment decisions teams. And it's pretty amazing how quickly it can jump.
So, Kaylee, between 2012, like when you started, and pre-COVID, so maybe like 2019 version 6, were there any major changes in the verification process that we've sort of outlined, or anything that's shifted? I know a lot changed, after COVID, but
yeah. Well, a couple things that's really testing my memory, Ryan, but I think a couple things that I remember and was a part of, this is high level, but back when I started, B Corp's recertified every 2 years. I don't remember what year now that we decided to put forth a proposal to move it to 3 years based on feedback, a lot of feedback from businesses, honestly, and also just in the data we had on changes that occurred in a 2-year time period. That was a big one, especially for, if you can think of, internally at B Lab Global, what that meant for number of certifications. Because you have to remember, as we're increasing number of B Corps, we're increasing number of recertifications every year too, right? So that was a big change. There was a lot of, I'm thinking, specific changes around the standards themselves. There were tweaks to what the impact pillars were. So we went through a really, again, I forget what years, but we spent a lot of time thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was a lot of some newer standards that we were implemented around that topic because it was recognized that there weren't necessarily enough. And that became kind of a clear section in the assessment. This isn't really relevant to everyone, but there are addenda. So there are very specific industries. We increased those over time. It was a huge part of adding the higher education addenda to the assessment and working with.
Was that for laureate education?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time working with laureate and building that out. The pending B Corp certification came about between that time period, where we came up with a process for businesses that were less than a year old that did not exist when I started. And that's now, I think, something that's been around quite a while. Yeah. And then I think just lots of little changes that may not be apparent to everyone, but if you were to compare the B Impact Assessment version 2 to 6, there's a lot of overlap, but a lot of nuance, especially, like I said, with answer options, which might seem small, but that really sets the stage of what is assumed to be business quo and what's to be seen as better than that. And the scoring also, there were changes to the scoring quite a lot. If you really want to get nerdy, even how NA questions were scored, like there was so much behind the scenes stuff that went into the standards that, again, I think most wouldn't even know was discussed or changed. But again, and a lot based on feedback from the businesses and data that we, showed how we were doing it was fine for what got us here, but moving forward, we need to change it. I'm sure there's tons of there are new impact business models added. Like I said, of course, right now, I can't think of specifics. Definition of
the whole
local
customer
change.
Section.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That was
Ryan,
like
you
a whole
remember
new
better than
section.
me. That was a whole new section. So, and that, yes, that's a huge one, is adding a new pillar. And the customer section is quite short, but it looks at specifically how you're interacting with your customers. Some of that came with a lot of like the data breaches and data privacy becoming a topic that just wasn't as much talked about in 2012. So yeah, that's a great example. And some things that may seem small but had big outcomes, like the definition of local, that has changed over time as better information's out there. That might seem really small, but like that was actually a big deal for a lot of questions. Yeah. So there's a ton, but I'm glad you brought up the customer section because that's definitely a huge one. I should also mention that part of the B Impact Assessment is the disclosure questionnaire. That might be called something different today, but that was always a part of it. It didn't have to do with scoring, but is where we asked companies to share with us transparently if there were areas for disclosure. That changed drastically over time as well. Again, based on what we were hearing and what trends were. Yeah. And then the whole interface itself changed too on how people experience the standards. I'm sure, Ryan, you've been around from the beginning. So if you remember your experience of going through that then to now, it's not perfect, of course, but eLab has spent a lot of time thinking about how people interact with the questions and what information is there to describe the intent of the question. Like so much of that is new or was new compared to when I started. The other thing, which is another change, is when I started, there was a very US centric assessment. And we also had, it was developed and emerging market. Those were the two options when you completed the assessment. So something that seems like everyone does, in the US was completely innovative for another region. So the different regional tracks were meant to show the difference between the two. It's still not perfect, but when I was there, a big change is they introduced a third track, which was the global track, which was meant to definitely try to get away from being US centric and was, introducing different types of questions. And for that, scoring was very different because now in Europe, for example, very, very different standards when it comes to things like paid leave and healthcare, that might be state given. So that was a huge change too, to try to better represent through scoring and the questions and answer options, the actual impact of that practice for where the company was primarily operating. But the whole science behind that, that luckily I never really had to dive too far into that. As a standards analyst, you got mostly very lovely companies, and you also got people who were very upset because of these things. And remember, there's 100+ questions on the assessment. So there's a lot of places for people to, feel misrepresented or they just don't understand. So that job took a lot of patience. It was super interesting and it was super rewarding, but there were days where honestly it was hard too, because not everyone is nice at times and you got the brunt of that. And you knew they just wanted to certify like they had these goals and you were the person who was saying the credit is here or not. So that sometimes you made them really happy and sometimes you had to deliver news that, they didn't like.
Yeah, as many tough review decisions that I've seen in the past, I'm always like, the analyst is just one person in this whole process and system, and it's really important to remember that we are all people and we need to treat each other with respect.
How did you feel about, I remember Green USGBC, the Green Building Council, had this same challenge where they were both the certification and the verifier within the same entity. And they created the Green Building Certification Institute. I think it's like GBCI. And so I know B Lab may be moving to that now. And I'm curious back, maybe this is even in these earlier days, pre-COVID, or maybe it's during COVID. What were the discussions of like, should we actually be doing the verification at all in-house? And like, should we be shifting it out? And like, what were the pluses and minuses that your team was debating back then?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, definitely a conversation happening at the highest level at B Lab, like at the board, even because there are regulations for certifying bodies. Those have increased over time, which, yeah, like the conversation today is kind of moving more towards that because of, especially in Europe, like that being a requirement. So at risk over time of a certification not being able to exist in a certain area if it's not separated, and that is seen as best practice. I think, early days, like I said, it's part of growing up is financially, at least early on, keeping everything in one place made a lot of sense because you could operate with a smaller staff that does more than one thing. The standards are they are complex. Comprehensive might be a better word. So, when weighing the pros and cons, it's like knowing this is something we're going to have to do eventually. But prior to me being in that training role that I came back in, and maybe for the listener too, for some context, I was at B Lab for 2012 to 2018. I took 1 year off to go to grad school in Scotland, came back in right before COVID as overseeing training and knowledge. And part of that role being needed was just the sheer amount of information that an analyst needs to be able to work with a business and be trained on, you can think about the processes, let alone the standards. So thinking of having an outside, partner verify, it's just like, how are we going to train someone to do that? So part of my role, was creating online training courses for our own team that was now very global, to be able to try, especially with COVID, we're not in an office, to try to do that. But, even having online courses, the question is like, how do we handle all these internal processes we've created, like assessment decisions, like the background checks? Like, it's not just as easy as saying, okay, this body is going to, talk to the business and verify their answers. There's all these other things we need them to do, and those are built in-house. So it's like a very complex move to that. So I think it was always on B Lab's mind. And over time, if you look at the small changes internally made to like get assessment decisions more electronic and actually like have it in a database, like moving it so it became easier for someone, we were really thinking of our internal team to be able to come in and have easier access to information they need to make decisions for their job and to uphold the standards. But yeah, that's just challenging in-house. So we knew that would be really, really hard to do with a partner. But it is best practice. And I think we knew that is where B Lab had to go, as certification was increasing, specifically with multinationals and businesses that were, like out in the public eye and names that people knew. You also have to think about credibility and risk. So yeah, I think at that, even like on-site visits, were probably like the first times using partners. And early days, B Lab had a relationship with Deloitte, I think before I even started there, so it's not like a new thing to work with partners, but to fully move to that it's a slow process, but one that's necessary and eventually will have to be done. So, yeah.
So let's this question may broach going into COVID, which can then bring us a little more up to speed with just all the changes that have been made. So, we have the pipeline for B Corps and your verification pipeline, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like growing, but it's not like hockey stick, right? You're maybe getting like, maybe that's a
Pre-COVID,
question.
yes.
Yeah, pre-COVID, do you know, I mean, this is really testing your memory, but like how many companies maybe were you seeing in a year in the verification pipeline?
I don't know that, but we could dig. There's a blog post I wrote, and I remember there's a graph that I put in there, and it has year by year growth. I don't have it in front of me, but it does exist. And I think, but you are right. It was always increasing. every year. And again, you got to think about the research that are also increasing alongside of that. So our pipeline was not just new, but was research and on-sites, because there was 10% random chosen amount of the community that had on-sites every year. So all of that is increasing, I'd say, fairly steadily from at least my time, 2012 to 2018. There might be hockey sticks in certain regions, obviously, because now we have new global partners starting, and we would usually see an uptick, and that would mean we'd have an uptick 3 years later in research. But generally, yes, like steady growth. I wish I had the numbers in front, but
Okay.
but yeah, I'd say steady.
Right. So then we come to COVID. You're like just getting back from Scotland. You're like, ready to chill back into this job at B Lab. And COVID happens. Everyone's on lockdown. And then walk us through what is happening with verification team
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
this 2020 early
Yeah.
to mid COVID zone.
Yeah. So it's so funny because I can still remember my last day, and by then we were in Berwyn, which is just up the street from Wayne. But I can remember we had just hired a new group of cohort of analysts, and they were in the office 2 days, and then we were at home, and then ended up being at home for, we all know that story, a long time. But I would say B Lab responded to COVID, or when that happened, very similar to most businesses and organizations, right? You don't quite know what's going to happen. I think the thought was, we know that this is a strain on individuals and businesses, so certification may no longer be, a priority. So B Lab was kind of preparing for a higher number of decertifications, companies, withdrawing and not paying their annual fee and stopping certification. We kind of expected that number of submissions, so companies hitting a button, I'm interested, would decrease. We thought maybe even our current pipeline, might end up putting attention and money elsewhere. So B Lab, like most places, kind of paused on hiring and kind of was we need to also watch our own financials and see what happens, but expecting maybe for the first time to see a dip. And we continued, on, and I was again in that training knowledge role. So I remember I was making 2-3 courses a week because now all onboarding was online. So I'm all right, we got to get this learning management system up, because we had those 4 employees that had started that we kept training. Yeah. And then I think, surprising to most, kind of the opposite happened. And we did see a bit more of that hockey curve. And I think, by then we had a lot of interest. There was obviously some wait, but I think this is really the turning point where the interest really went in a direction we didn't expect. And then we didn't necessarily have all the resources to respond the same way we had in the past, because we hadn't been hiring, the same way, so yeah, it was really interesting. And I think it's a mixture of businesses actually maybe having a little bit more time during COVID for some, and those that weren't financially, strapped were oh, I finally have time to fill out this assessment. I also think that COVID really, in a way, for some people, it really helped them understand that there's more to life than profit. And I think we had more businesses and individuals thinking about, how can I actually work with my community? How do I treat my employees when stuff like this happens? So that was one good, I think, outcome of COVID, is it kind of made people think. And I do think that maybe some businesses that were not sure if they wanted to pursue or not were you know what, I'm committed to doing business differently, and I want to, be joining this community and be recognized for it. So for lots of reasons and other reasons, we, saw this huge spike. And then we had to start playing catch up. And once we saw that demand was there, and we didn't see a big increase in decertifications, it was just we were really surprised. We then, of course, as soon as we could, tried to start hiring. But as I mentioned earlier, with this kind of complexity, it's not you hire an analyst and they start the next day. I don't think anyone would want that, right? It takes months. We had a training system and we did our best to be efficient and effective, but it still took months. You have to train, you have to shadow, you have to co-lead. We're not just throwing people into a certification process. So even if we could hire, we were still really quite behind. So it was a good problem to have, but it did mean that wait time from the time a company is submitting their assessment to being actually working with an analyst increased significantly. And B Lab, in my job, because then I pretty quickly was in that director role, was figuring out how do you communicate that transparently as much as you can, and how do we do what we can internally. We put everything on the table basically to say, how can we do this effectively and efficiently, but slightly faster? How can we bring on hires more quickly? How can we be innovative in how we're training? How can we, then the question of partnership came up pretty quickly, because we kind of more sooner than I think expected realized that maybe it's not sustainable to continue to do this all in-house when you need this amount of individuals. And I will say at the same time, we are all humans. So we are also going through COVID, and we are all working from home. And there are people working from home who have children that are running around and don't have a nice workspace or don't have great internet. Like, we're all learning how to do this. So there is stress on B Lab employees, just like there was on anyone. And then we're extra stressed because we're seeing that there's this demand and we need to respond to. So it was a tough time. I can share, like, as someone supporting a large, team at that time, it was really hard. And again, like a good problem to have for the network or the community, but challenging. And a lot of businesses didn't understand, why is there this wait?
Yeah, so there was quite an increase in interest for new certification, and then there, is always recertification. And I think that's sort of where the pipeline, quote unquote, the backlog started. And I know that when I joined B Lab, I had joined sort of right around the time where the network was offering folks like a 6-month grace period for recertifying companies to get some additional time to meet their recertification deadlines. And then that also ended up contributing to the backlog later in the process. But were there some other strategies that you all had discussed to address the pipeline backlog?
Yeah, so that was definitely one of them, to try to give our research more time. Some of them needed it, and also we needed it. So that was one. I mentioned building capacity. So, we trialed new hiring techniques, new training techniques to try to get the current, the individuals we had up to speed as quickly as we can. There were also things that I'm sure, this is for those that were going through the process, perhaps during this time, there were slight changes to process that were trialed. So moving around when things were asked of a company to asking, I don't remember the actual date of prepayment, but, doing what we can, because up into there was a time where you didn't have to pay anything until you were done certifying. So we had to also what can we do to make sure the companies that we're working with are serious about it and have a good chance of certifying? And how do we catch as early as possible, not just for our time, but for their time and resources? How do we see early on if we think that they are eligible? So there were things like eligibility requirements that were introduced. So businesses had to submit some documentation ahead of their traditional verification process so that things could be reviewed. And earlier on, we could tell them, hey, you're probably not ready. Or introducing a part of the price early on made sure that people that came to us were actually interested and committed, because believe it or not, we would have businesses that would go through the entire process and then never pay. And then, we did all this work and they didn't actually certify at the end. So yeah, there was lots of different procedural things that we did. And again, with the goal of maintaining the standards. So we talked a lot about that risk and rigor piece. So just really being thoughtful, okay, for a zero worker, a sole contract, consultant, what do we actually feel like we need for them? Do we really need them to provide the same amount of documentation as maybe someone who has a team of 10, So we even got more granular with looking at that risk and rigor piece, whereas previously we were, of course, looking at it, but more at a wider scale. And so that's about the time that there were, different processes put out. So there was, I think up to 6 different ones, depending on the size and industry. There was a lot of complexity, but all of that was to try to be really appropriate with the amount of time and verification that we were requiring. I have the numbers now, so just to give you a sense for that growth. So from January 2020 to this was written in 2022. So about, almost a 2-year time period, we had over 6,000 applications. And that was a 38% increase from the previous period.
Yeah, that's wild.
The community was 4,500 at that time, and we had 6,000 applications. And then, the year-over-year growth was just crazy. We had the number of certifying B Corps also, like in 2020 alone, there were 742, 2021, 951, like 28% increase. Yeah, the numbers are, when I started, around 700 companies. Right around COVID, we were up to 4,500. So yeah, there's some really great information out there. I don't know if we can include that maybe in this post to show you the growth from this blog post that I wrote around that time. But yeah, we did all that we could, and not everything worked. So we had a lot of brainstorm sessions where we did what we could. And at the same time, we're hiring as quickly as we can, and we're training as quickly as we can all the time.
Yes, and I think you had started, I don't remember when this started happening, but Global started like asking global partners to be a lot more involved in the process, which is an interesting sort of like cycle in general. It's like, okay, we need some distance, and then actually, no, we need your help to make sure that folks are prepared and educated through this process. And it makes a lot of sense because global partners have many more touch points with companies who are applying and then also recertifying. But I think there were a couple of different ways that Global piloted outsourcing, eval, and verification. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So a big conversation we had at this time is, what is actually verification? Right. So we'd like a conversation of, this kind of goes back to where we started in this conversation. What actually is verification, and when does that start? And we realized that, like, I remember when I started at B Lab, we would spend like the first 20 minutes on a review call going over, like, this is what the B Corp certification is. These are the benefits of it. This is the term sheet you're going to sign. You have to, we would tell them like 20 minutes of like this little presentation. And we realized, like, that's not something we really need to do. And that's something that actually probably is more in the global partners camp, because it's really just education and gauging interest. I can tell you, early days, I would have that call and go over, like, this is the cost per year. And that would be the first time these companies were hearing this. And they'd be like, wait, what? So we're like, we can't be spending time with those businesses. We need them to come educated, prepared, and ready. So we decided that's not verification, right? That's not. And then even like understanding a bit of the history of the company, we'd spend another like 20 minutes on that. When did you start, and how many employees you have? We're like, well, that's something that they could probably put in a document that could be verified by a global partner, because again, that's not verification. That's just like company information. So we played around with, at that time, what can we have global partners assist with, because they can help us make sure that the businesses that are assigned an analyst are actually ready to go. They're eligible. They are committed for everything that's required, and they've had a touch point. And that actually, I think it was really successful. And it meant that a lot of that pressure, some of that was taken off of B Lab. And verifiers who are really trained in the technical standards could focus on that part of the role. So that's a great example of something that was done. And then at the same time, to jump to like the other side of things is, as I said, we were hiring as quickly as we could. Around the same time, the other thing that's happening is, like, we are getting higher visibility as a community of B Corp, because we're increasing in numbers. We're getting some large B Corps, so there's more scrutiny. And it becomes even more important to really think about, how do we make sure that we look at conflict of interest, but also are credible. And at the end of the day, we can't hire, like I said earlier, people in every country who speak every language. So this is around the time where we were already thinking of it, like I mentioned, of how do we bring on a partner to support with verification that's not B Lab Global employees, but is trained by B Lab Global. And of course, the standards continue to be maintained by B Lab Global. And that is how the birth of the partnership with Genashtim was formed.
What is Genashtim, and why Genashtim?
Yeah, good question. So Genashtim is actually a B Corp, and they do a variety of different things. They've worked with businesses in different ways and have been like in the certification and standards space, not themselves as a certifying body, but like consulting on that. And they are based in Singapore. but they have employees that are kind of all over. And they do some e-learning as well as ESG services. So they kind of had some skill sets already that would be needed or relevant for standards. So when we had the high demand, there were a couple people that we were already kind of thinking about, but Janashtam already had like 20 full-time individuals that they were able to pretty quickly like pivot to working with certification if needed. And Thomas, who's the CEO of Janashtam and the founder, I worked really closely with him. And of course, he worked with leadership at B Lab, but we worked together on how we could kind of have some rapid growth in increasing. So yeah, you can read more about Janashtam, but they are a B Corp. They do really great work. And important for us, they had employees in time zones that we didn't. And they had language skills that we didn't. And like I said, they already came with like a similar topical skill set, which we knew would be relevant to the B impact assessment. So yeah, we started out with like 20, I think, if I remember correctly. And yeah, so I was overseeing that partnership along with kind of the overall training plan at that time. And yeah, a lot of trial and error, right? So I was telling you, like, it takes a long time to train. So how do we train people who don't have access to the same, even in like internal tools, right? Like that alone is something you have to think about. And they don't have access to the same information. They need some type of email address. Like there was so much to think about, but we managed it and we did it fairly quickly. We started with 20 individuals as a trial. We had to shift some of B Lab Global Standards analysts to more support analysts because now we needed them to be meeting with these individuals and like helping them identify when something needs to go to assessment decisions or like, playing a role to them that, a manager would to you if you were an analyst. So there was and that's like upskilling to individuals. There was a lot of shifting going on, but the partnership, I think, ended up being like quite successful. Of course, there was still a wait time, but we were able to definitely decrease the pipeline wait list. And I think what's really important is we were able to bring on like all the things I've been talking about with the challenges of language and time zone. We were able to bring people on, and it was really cool to be able to assign someone a company in, a country that previously we had no experience with and could actually speak, Chinese with them or whatever it may be. We almost more had the issue of the other side of there were a lot of people in the APAC region and they had to work with, some people on the West Coast in the US. So we actually ended up having more of, if anything, like a challenge from time zones that way. Yeah. And that only has increased over time. I don't exactly know where they're at right now as far as numbers, but I can tell you when I was there, I think when I left, they were up to maybe 50 verification analysts through Janashtam, not all working full time. And now B Lab has like a robust team, a partnership team that is solely there to support these outside verifiers. And I know they're exploring what that looks like in the future. And I can't really speak much because it's been 2 years, but my time there, it was like really crucial with us responding to those COVID times.
Yeah. You are mentioning time zones and languages, and there's, a degree of flexibility as well in a partnership like this. But I think it was a pilot to begin with, and I'm curious if there were if there was a lot of feedback throughout the process from all the stakeholders, and maybe what were some of the challenges. And then I think you you left at a time where they were really deciding whether they were going to continue that, but sort of like, what are the pros and cons of a partnership like this?
Yeah. Great question. And that reminds me, we did a little pilot before we officially worked with Janashtam. I forgot I even did that. There was a small pilot of maybe 4 consultants that we worked with on a very short-term basis to trial it out. And that gave us enough confidence to move forward with this. But of course, COVID and our wait times, we moved, like I said, more quickly than I probably would have thought. Pros, so we could pretty quickly have 20 people ready to go. So like time to hire, and hiring is really expensive. Probably most people know that. So that alone, like cost effective. We had people from Janashtam in 20 different countries and 6 continents, and they spoke multiple languages. So again, that was a huge relief to have some people who knew the local context, could speak and read in that language. And it really, I think, opened us up to be able to support companies for some in a much better way, right, than previously. Of course, a benefit was we could move through a little bit more quickly our pipelines. So I think the wait times went down. We did first trial this with recertifications because it was less risky. So that the pilot you're talking about with them, that's how we started. And we started really small, so we looked at the least risky businesses, research, they've already been reviewed multiple times. So we started, as small as we could, and then worked our way up as people and individuals that were going through that training program, showed us that they were understanding it and were able to apply it. So I think there were tons of benefits there. The partnership alone was a huge pro, just working with Thomas and Jen Ashton, and the individuals are amazing. They all were so enthusiastic and fantastic. So from my experience, that was a very pleasant relationship that was created. On the cons, that side, I think from the perspective of the business going through the recertification, it was confusing for some. I will say, for better or worse, some individuals recertified multiple times at B Lab. They might have had, they know individuals, right? They are familiar with the B Lab team. They know what to expect. They know the level of customer service to expect. They're used to the way their comments are written, and all of that. You've done it enough that you expect it. So to come and recertify for maybe the fourth time, and now it's a slightly different process. It's someone who's in a different time zone than you. It's someone who has only been, doing this for a month. It, of course, is going to be a different experience. So, I don't think across the board, because we tracked satisfaction and feedback really closely during that time. Overall, it was positive, but there were definitely instances where people weren't happy. So I think that was one con was, and I think looking back at it, I could have, and B Lab could have maybe communicated a little bit, better, but we were making decisions and working so quickly. So it was hard to make sure everyone understood, hey, this is the challenge we've been facing. This is how we're responding to it. So some people came not knowing why we're working with a partner. And there were, of course, questions about that. So yeah, I think for some, the customer service experience didn't feel the same as before. And that was challenging. And of course, some were uncomfortable, some businesses, with the idea of a partner verifying them just because it was unfamiliar. And I don't know if it's common knowledge that to be a certifying body, best practice is that you have someone else doing the verifying. If you're part of the B Corp certification and that's the only certification you have, you might not know that. So it does feel like this was a really homegrown and cozy. We're all a family. We're all in this together. And now it feels maybe a slightly different process. And again, that's what we're moving towards. And that's ultimately best for the standards and for those in the movement to make sure it stays credible. But not everyone had that same feeling. The other con I would just say is, we did have to expedite the training process. So, we had to do what we could, and we didn't do anything that was too risky or we felt, risked the credibility, but it definitely, the days of having a year onboarding had to be over. We had to think of ways to do it differently. And that came with its challenges, just as any new thing does.
Yeah. And I think it's a little bit if you talk to companies or people who have been through the verification process sort of the last few years, or since COVID, it's been wait times has been big. At one point, I think it was you submitted, then you waited 12 months. It's until someone got back. So, but sort of it is what it is, right? That's why it's helpful to hear your side of it. And then, yeah, inconsistency. Another one would be inconsistency of analysts. So you might have, especially for B consultants, because we often work with say many companies. So it's well, wait, this analyst said this and this one said this. And so I think it has been helpful for me to hear what you were saying, which is yeah, it used to be 12 months, onboarding for analysts, but we had a 30-day, hey, we need people in, and and so it does lead in some inconsistencies.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe if I can speak to one other thing about the wait time, it's semi-related and the partnership helped with this. But one thing I don't know if a lot of people understand is that, B Lab Global serves all of the global partners. And every year the global partners, we all do our planning, our annual planning. And that includes, based on their pipeline, how many companies they think they'll certify, because we all need that for our budget, right? To know how many analysts do we think we need and how much time, and even for revenue planning. And part of the wait time, which I think was really why it was hard for B Lab to say exactly when you would be due, like we couldn't say like you're number 402 or it's going to be 36 days, was because really for equity reasons, B Lab has to ensure that they are working with a mixture of businesses in the different global partner regions. So it might be that a company in Peru certified or submitted today, and your business in the US submitted 30 days ago, but B Lab might pick up that Peru company today because Sistema B didn't have a lot of submissions and we need to be working with them. So it made it really hard to give estimates. And I don't think a lot of people understand that, it was more nuanced than just taking the next person. We had to make sure, and again, you had to make sure you had the analysts that could work with them. So the partnership, it did make things challenging, but at least we were able to, because we did the same thing for language. Like we don't have anyone that can take French right now because those people already are full. So that unfortunately that company might have to wait a little longer. So with the partnership, we were to work with Janasham to say, hey, we're seeing a really influx in this language. And they were able to, through their hiring and their network, be able to pretty quickly say, hey, I have 5 people who speak that language and could start training next month. But yeah, back to your point, Ryan, it definitely, for people who had been around a while, and I know the B consultants, it did feel different. And it was definitely some challenges, especially early days, as we were all trying to figure out even the logistics of, like I said, how do these people have emails? How do they have access to certain, what do we want them to have access to? And of course, they all signed non-disclosure agreements, and we went through conflict of interest, like all of those best practices, but it's still meant like it was pretty rocky at the start, like most pilots are.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, I think what you just mentioned is like, I think really important, because I think there's a broader question of just like, why is verification a black box? Does it feel like a black box at B Lab? And I think you mentioned one of them, which is, for a multitude of different reasons, it's not first in, first out. Are there other sort of reasons why you think like maybe it's moving really quickly and sort of like building the plane as we're flying it? Or like, what are the other reasons you feel like the verification has seemed like a black box for a lot of people?
Yeah. So I think part of it is that part of it is B Lab Global has a lot of stakeholders, right? And like I can speak from being on that team, it can be a lot because you have your global partners, you have businesses, you have consultants, you have your own internal team now, you have partners. And all of them have different needs and requirements and different contracts and different expectations. So I felt like at B Lab sometimes coming to what could actually be shared transparently was sometimes challenging to come to an agreement because of all these factors. And like I said, we really wanted to get to a point where it didn't feel like a black box and you knew exactly like what was going on. But we trialed that very briefly, and it actually, I think, did more harm than good because it wasn't accurate, So it is very, I think, nuanced because of the stakeholders and the different components. I think, the standards are complex. All the things we talked about on this call, background checks, standards advisory council reviews, decisions on innovative practices, challenges with, sometimes businesses are also delayed in getting us what we need in the verification process. All those things are factors that even if we say this should take 3 months, sometimes it's the business that's making it longer too. So it's just so hard to, one, communicate that without overwhelming. And two, if we do communicate, we want to communicate accurately. And that we kind of just really were challenged. We didn't find a good way of doing that when I was there. And then I think, quite honestly, it's just that, B Lab is like resource challenged. When I was there for all of the, they are a nonprofit charity, and that's the reality. So, I think, could we get to the point where more can be shared openly? Maybe. I think that takes a lot of money and tech to figure out how to do that. So when I was there, the best we did was try to share openly in things like blogs and with global partners and try to share what we can. But I know that wasn't enough always. But I do think, as one benefit of moving towards outside verification B Lab's not there yet. But if you look at other certifying bodies, like say, organic certification, that works really differently. When you're ready to certify, you have a option of a list of certifying bodies that are trained and ready to certify on that topic. And you pick the one you want, and they might have slightly different prices, they have different timelines. So it's more on demand. And I think eventually that might be how the B Corp certification gets to, and that would alleviate a lot of these wait time challenges. But yeah, it's not there yet. So it's the growing pains, it's building the plane as you go, and it's just doing the best you can in the middle of that with limited resources. But yeah, I think it is more complex than most people think. And we always also have to be careful with how much we share, because sometimes the things to share aren't ours to share. If it's something related to a global partner's decision or something that happens with this particular company that's not transparent information, but might be taking a lot of B Lab's time. Not all of that can be communicated in a way that, would be ideal.
What is something you wish you could have said to B Corps and other outside stakeholders, but couldn't at the time?
Yeah, great question. I said this a little bit, but I wish I could change the timing, maybe, of when I said it. Because when I'm looking back at the communications I was able to put out on behalf of the team around the wait times and the delays in hiring, it was 2022. It was 2 years after really it happened. And I think what I wish I could have changed is the timeliness of sharing, one, the reminder of, the spirit of the B Corp movement. When you think of the values and the spirit of the B Corp movement, we're all in this because we want the world to be a better place, and we're trying to be creative and being part of that solution. And I think sometimes that can be lost in a verification process. So what I wish I would have been able to say sooner, part of it was just reminding, we're all going through COVID right now. We're all human beings. The verifier on the other end is a human being just like you. And we're all trying to figure out how we work remotely and how we support our family and friends during the pandemic. And we have anxiety and pressure around that too. And can we come with a spirit of patience? I wish I could have said that right away and not 2 years later for the sake of my team. I think the other thing that I wish that I could have communicated more directly, more quickly, was just all of the things that B Lab did. B Lab did react really quickly to the challenges once we figured out the reality of where we were. But for lots of reasons, we couldn't share what we were working on right away. But I know if we could have, I think that would have made the response that we got a little bit easier. Yeah, but I also think maybe the final thing I'd say, and I think most B Corps in the community know this, people who are interested in it, is it's a really good problem to have for there to be wait times and for B Lab to be figuring out how to maintain the credibility of the certification. It's frustrating, but those are all really great problems to have and really great signs that I think the system is changing, even if it is slowly or more slowly than I'd like it to be, but that is all really headed in the right direction. And I think if we can keep those values and spirits at the first and foremost thing that we're thinking about, I'm hoping that some of these logistical issues and challenges we face become secondary. And I know it's frustrating, but I think it's worth the wait. And yeah, just remembering we're all human and we're all part of this process together, and we all kind of have the same vision and mission in mind, which you can't say for a lot of services that you're going through. So yeah, I wish I could say those things sooner, but yeah.
This is extra tricky when
It is
building the plane as you fly it.
Mm-hmm.
We so appreciate all the things that you have done for the movement and at B Lab. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you are doing now in your consulting work.
Yeah, I'd love to. So since I left B Lab, I've been, out on my own doing my own consulting. I have, of course, always been really interested in social environmental impact. So part of what I do is helping businesses understand their mission and their goals and outcomes, but then importantly, how to tie that to key performance indicators to actually measure it. Because without measuring it, how do you know how you're doing? And if you don't know how you're doing, how can you improve and create more impact? But I've also been doing strategy and innovation work. So yeah, I work with lots of businesses. I'm specifically working with the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, WWF. I'm part of their consultant innovation team, and I'm leading efforts on measuring innovation culture and use of innovation in conservation for them. And yeah, it's been really fun getting to know a lot of businesses and organizations and help them kind of more holistically.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what is something we ask all of our guests? What is something that you need right now, and how can listeners support your work?
Great question. And thanks for asking. I am still pretty new at this, consulting. So I'm based in Pennsylvania, as we said in the beginning, and I'm like actively figuring out a community that I can be a part of that's doing like-minded work related to this. So if anyone has recommendations for groups or different networking groups that I could be a part of, that would be fantastic. I'm definitely looking to have conversations since I'm still new in the space. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest one. I want to be connected, and a lot of my clients are international right now, which is fantastic, but I specifically would love a more localized group.
And how can we learn more about your work? I know I've seen your lovely LinkedIn updates, but I'm not sure if there's like somewhere specifically that you're sharing more about your work.
Yeah, so I do have a website now. It's kaligibson.com, and my LinkedIn is also linked there if you want to check it out. That's usually where I put some updates.
Yay. Haley, just wanted to say thank you so much for joining. Yeah, I think this is a really important topic. It's like, this is the comms we sort of needed, but it's like, maybe we're getting it 2 years later. It's like, what really happened there? And like, but yeah, I just really appreciate you for being, transparent and honest. And then, yeah, just the service you put in at B Lab during those really hard times. That was a lot. And yeah, so just really appreciate you.
Thank you both for having me. It's been a really fun conversation. And yeah, I'm excited that I was able to reconnect and think about the movement and talk about it again. It was a fun time.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts." Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.